What is up, y'all? We are here for our Saturday night secret sermon, everybody's favorite secret teachings of Jesus. This is our weekly segment where we delve into the Gnostic Gospels, and I would like to, right now we're in the Nag Hammadi scriptures. I'd like to eventually hit up the Dead Sea Scrolls. Get to all of them, really. But we're trucking along, and we are in this big fatty Bovati here, so we're having a good time. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can go to my channel, and while you're there, subscribe. Light, Love, Magic. I'm Liz. Hello. And you will find a playlist entitled Secret Teachings of Jesus, and this will have anything we've covered in the Gnostic Gospels. So far, I think we've covered the Secret Book of James, and then after that we did the Gospel of Philip, and then we just finished the Gospel of Mary. So all of them have been wonderful, and I've loved them all. So I was really wondering what we would be covering next. I was really thinking I might go into the Secret Book of John. I was just like flipping through the book this morning, and it didn't feel quite right to go into the Secret Book of John yet. It felt a little bit dense, like we needed some preparation. And then I started to maybe consider the Gospel of Judas for next. But again, that felt like we needed something like a foundation before we jumped into the Gospel of Judas as well. So I was looking around more, and my feelers latched on to the Gospel of Thomas. And then when I went on a run, I was praying, and I asked, like this afternoon, I went on a run before work, and I was praying, and I was asking God, like, which one do you want me to cover next? Like, which one are we going to do? And I was like, I think that I'm going to do the Gospel of Thomas. And I looked down in the street, and there was this like glistening piece of green glass, it was like little tiny, but it looked like an emerald or something, like a treasure on the ground, and I don't know, for me, any sparkly object of a brilliant color is valuable. It doesn't matter if it's a piece of broken glass or a precious gem. So I kept jogging, and I was like, I'll go back for it, or I'll pass it again when I come up the hill, and if I see it, I'll grab it as my indication that it is a green for a go on the Gospel of Thomas. And I jogged back up the hill, and I didn't see it, and I was obsessed, and I was like, no, I must have this green speck of glass. It was the greenest thing I've ever seen, and it was at that point like sort of like this sign, it was like one of those little nuggets from the angels, and I was like, oh, I passed my treasure. What have I done? I took it for granted, and then I found the glass. I was like, oh, okay, great, and I held it preciously in my palm as I was jogging. And then by the time I got back in my driveway, I was doing like lunges. And when I opened my door to go inside, I realized that I dropped it somewhere. And I was like, my precious gem, I lost awareness. I disconnected from my consciousness, and I dropped it. And that to me was such a metaphor for our state of mind, for our consciousness. Because all it takes is slipping into a few moments and then of just like kind of disengagement from having awareness, from having presence, and then suddenly you're ruminating on world wars and horrors and that thing you said that time that somebody saw you do in like 8th grade that like they really took it like the wrong way and it was a big misunderstanding. You know what I mean? Like you just start going into like rehearsing those conversations, the confrontations in your mind, that you never have and you won't. And all of a sudden it's like you've worked yourself up into this fog of basically like dead air, but static. Static that costs you your connection to your potency and power in that moment. And so at any moment, and then, you start going into like visualizing these like, maybe negative thoughts or fearful thoughts or, ominous thoughts. It's hard not to right now. If you, walk out the door, it's like all these different issues all at once. And that's what it is to practice, self-mastery and presence and awareness of our consciousness, because in that instant where we slip into fearful thinking and catastrophizing, we cut ourselves off from having affinity with the Holy Spirit, with God, with the Creator, and therefore we cut ourselves off from that blessing and that flow and that, that protection. But in an instant, that grace can bring you right back. Right? When you remember, recenter, get grounded, trust, put my thoughts on something of a higher vibration. Like this morning and many times, like I will start getting into, I don't know, the fearful thoughts will come, and then it will spiral into depressing thoughts, disempowering thoughts. And if you've ever seen the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's, not The Breakfast at Tiffany's, but Breakfast at Tiffany's, Holly Golightly, this character, she's sort of this ragtag misfit who's had to sort of like figure out how to survive, with like a 14-year-old's education. She kind of was a runaway. And she is kind of a call girl around New York. She's like an escort. And so she's like walking home at the beginning of the movie from last night's escapades. And she's still in her like kind of like evening cocktail wear. She has her bag of donuts and her coffee. And she goes to the window of Tiffany's, sorry. Cartier. Missed the whole point of the name of the movie. At Tiffany's. What is that? Henry Winston? I don't know. The other diamond place, not Tiffany's. So she's standing and eating her breakfast at Tiffany's, like looking at the window, just staring at the diamonds. And later on in the movie, she talks about getting a mean case of the reds. Instead of the blues, she gets the reds. And the reds, like, and she tells her friend, like, she likes to go to Tiffany's when she gets a mean case of the reds, because she's like, it's such a dignified place. Like, nothing awful could really happen in Tiffany's, could it? And you're like, yeah, I kind of know, but maybe. So the mean reds are fear, anxiety, anxiety attack, doom, dread, all of those things. So, that state, when we fall into that, like I get the mean case of the reds sometimes, and that it's in those moments where I say, okay, instead of sitting here slipping further into the tar pits like Atreyu's horse from Neverending Story, when he was being killed by the nothing, I will continue in my prayer ritual for the morning. I'll snap back into focus, and I'll do some Zohar lessons, and I will scan the 72 names of God, which are collections of sets of 3 Hebrew letters, and there's 72 combinations of sets of 3 letters that make up these names of God, these powerful names of God. And there's like a table of them all. So I'll scan those, and then I will get out my Bible, and I like to read out of the Hebrew Transliteration Bible, and I will literally read the Hebrew out loud. Like, I'll scan the Hebrew letters, and then I'll read the Hebrew words out loud, even though I don't necessarily speak Aramaic or understand it. I can little by little, but and then I read the English. And so it's speaking out loud those words in Aramaic are like very powerful. It's very, very empowering and cleansing to the soul and to the energy. But then it's like it unlocks this deeper understanding of the scripture, because you're kind of slowing it down and you're taking it line by line. You're not just reading through it and skimming through it. You're thinking about each sentence on its own. And so I think that, it inspires so much more insight for me, and it just gets like, I don't know, just this flow of information starts pouring through when I read it like that. But it changes my constitution and it uplifts my spirit. And by the end of it, I feel hopeful again and optimistic and energetic. Whereas, if I stayed in that quagmire, I'm going to be spending the rest of the day going further and further into depression and despair and disempowerment. So that was the metaphor for the green glass. Okay, so we are going to get into the Gospel of Thomas. And I think that this one is it's going to help us for me to read the introduction. So we have a bit of context and insight about what we're reading before we jump into it. I know, this is what I know about the Gospel of Thomas getting started. That it is like the sayings of Jesus, and it's not like a narrative like the other Gospels. It's not even a gospel like Mary's, where it's sort of like this kind of play or scene playing out in these different acts. The other Gospels are kind of like that too. They tell a story. They tell us these scenes that play out. The Gospel of Thomas is like a stream of these sayings, these morsels of wisdom that Jesus dropped. Kind of like the Gospel of Philip, but the Gospel of Philip were portions of text that needed to be like meditated on, but they were like bigger portions, and they were kind of bigger ideas, and each their own sort of like esoteric metaphysical concept and symbolism. But I think the Gospel of Thomas is just these like phrases. So it'll be interesting to like each episode so far in, like, for instance, when we covered the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, we would just take it portion by portion. So it'll be interesting to see how the flow of these episodes go, if we're going to take it morsel by morsel, or if we're going to clump a couple of sayings together and see how time runs. But I don't know. We're flexible here. We're on the flying by the seat of our pants. Okay, so I'm going to read you guys the introduction to the Gospel of Thomas with the Greek Gospel of Thomas. So there must be maybe 2 copies of it, maybe a Coptic and a Greek, but I'm not sure about that. So I think we'll learn more as we read the introduction. So the Gospel of Thomas with the Greek Gospel of Thomas. I'm going to take a drink of my tea. It's interesting. You can really follow your intuition and instincts with everything. I was trying to decide what to make for tea today. Not for dinner, if those of you are in the UK, but like literally what kind of tea I was going to drink at work. And I had this really nice like fresh tea, like loose leaf tea, a bunch of them that my nephew and my niece-in-law got me for Christmas presents. And I hadn't tasted this one yet, and I never had it. And it Dong Kai maybe is the name of it. It's like a Chinese herbal tea, and I didn't really know what it was, but I've just been like all night long, I'm like, oh my gosh, it smells so neat. It smells like celery, and then it kind of tastes like celery. But then I'm also like, this is going to be TMI, but we're friends here. I have been having the worst menstrual like cramps and stuff over the last few days, and just a ferocious menstrual cycle. A literal werewolf is like clawing its way out of me. And I didn't realize this, but I looked it up when I got home. I was like, what is this tea? What is this? Like, is it actually celery? Is it a root, or what is it? And it's a root, and it's for menstrual issues. It helps cramps and all that stuff. And it helps with like perimenopause and menopause. So had no idea, but I was totally following my intuition. That's how you can, when your body has cravings, it usually tells you what your imbalances are. They say by the time you're thirsty, you're already past dehydration. Okay, so here we go. Let's get into it. So the Gospel of Thomas with the Greek Gospel of Thomas. Refutation of all heresies, introduced and translated by Marvin Meyer. The Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings of Jesus, numbered by scholars at 114 sayings. They are said to communicate salvation and life. In contrast to the New Testament Gospels, which focus upon the crucifixion and resurrection as they set forth a gospel of the cross, the Gospel of Thomas presents a figure of Jesus who does not die for anyone's sins on the cross and does not rise from the dead on the third day. Rather, in the tradition of Jewish teachers of wisdom, the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas utters wise sayings, one after another. And through these sayings, the Gospel of Thomas proclaims the gospel, or a gospel of wisdom. The wise sayings of the Gospel of Thomas may be considered sayings of the sages, quote unquote. Logoi sophon. I don't know. Logoi sophon? I don't know if I pronounced that right. I'm assuming that's Greek. On account of their wisdom orientation. Or they may be likened to the useful sayings. Crei. Anybody's guess. Attributed appropriately to a specific speaker in Greco-Roman rhetorical discussions. Further, although the Gospel of Thomas has some features in common with Gnostic texts, it is not easily classified as a Gnostic work without considerable qualification. The Gospel of Thomas receives its title from the titular subscript, and according to its incipit or prologue, the text consists of the hidden or secret sayings, Coptic, Nazje, Ephep, I don't know, Greek, hoi logai hoi, apocryphoi, that the living Jesus spoke and Judas-Thomas the twin recorded. Okay, I'm going to read that again, but I'm going to skip the parts that are hard to read because we don't know what that means anyway. Okay, so the Gospel of Thomas receives its title from the titular subscript, and according to its incipit or prologue, the text consists of hidden or secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Judas-Thomas the twin recorded. Judas-Thomas was thought in some circles, particularly within Syriac Christianity, to be the twin brother of Jesus. Okay, so I have heard this theory talked about by theologians, that there was like a theory amongst people at the time that Jesus had a twin brother. So I guess the twin would have been Judas-Thomas. So the Gospel of Thomas receives its title from the titular subject, and according to its incipit or prologue, the text consists of hidden, secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Judas-Thomas the twin recorded. Judas-Thomas was thought in some circles, particularly within Syriac Christianity, to be the twin brother of Jesus, and such the perfect person to function as guarantor of sayings of Jesus. Hence, the Gospel of Thomas may most appropriately be considered a sayings gospel with an incipient Gnostic perspective. So, In the early days of ancient Christianity, there were like these different groups that broke off, and they had their own schools of thought and understanding of Jesus and Christianity and creation. Even there, I think that when they talk about something not being like a traditional Gnostic gospel, it's because it's thrown in with these works, but there's something that runs consistent with the other ones, and I'm not sure that this is the criteria that classifies them as the Gnostics, but it seems like in the Gnostic Gospels, there are different levels of creator God, and there are these like archons, which are powers that are sort of like governors or rulers over the material world. And there are like ruling deities that are sort of like not necessarily all good, like our creator God. And so it kind of gets a lot more psychedelic and sci-fi in the Gnostic Gospels. And so remember that they were like the Gospel of Mary isn't necessarily a Gnostic gospel, but it's with the Gnostic works. They're like, she is not really getting into that dialogue about the other creation theories. So I can see how they were like, it's not really a Gnostic God. So like this one seems to be too just focused on the teachings of Jesus and not going back to like creation myth and theory, or even like beyond well, I don't know about beyond this realm, because those did too. Now, the secret book of John that the Gospel of Mary has referenced throughout the footnotes does kind of go into all those things too. So that's one other reason why I didn't get... Gospel of John will be really great to tie into supplemental reading to understand the Pistis Sophia. Okay. So let's get back into this. Oh, also there's a couple of footnotes down here. Logi Sophon. It's just like references to other studies and books. Okay. So, but like theological, not gospel related. Okay. Where did we leave off? So they think, okay, so who else but Judas-Thomas was thought in some circles, particularly within Syriac Christianity, to be the twin brother of Jesus, and as such the perfect person to function as the guarantor of sayings of Jesus. Hence, the Gospel of Thomas may most appropriately be considered a sayings gospel with an incipient Gnostic perspective. The sayings in the Gospel of Thomas include a variety of aphorisms, parables, stories, and other utterances ascribed to Jesus, the interpretation of which saying one announces can lead to salvation and life. The interpretation of which saying announces can lead to salvation and life. It's like got this like a one. That's why I'm like, this reads so weird. So the interpretation of which saying one announces, but it's like the number one and not, it's like they're numbering something. Okay, one announces can lead to salvation and life. Saying one states, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. So whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. there is hardly any narrative in the Gospel of Thomas, and there is hardly any narrative in the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel does not tell a story of the life of Jesus. Rather, Thomas's Jesus is a teacher of wisdom, and the value of Jesus lies in what he has to say and how his sayings lead to wisdom and understanding. So this is saying that they're not focused on Jesus being sacrificed for your sins and this is going to be your salvation in this particular gospel. In this gospel, they're choosing to focus on literally what Jesus is saying. If you can understand what he's saying, that is going to give you eternal life. This is going to liberate your soul and save you and give you salvation here on earth and in the afterlife for your soul. It's about understanding what he's saying more than just getting in on the deal as Jesus is going to... Are you guys want to be saved by Jesus' sacrifice? Everybody get in. Jesus is going to sacrifice himself for us all. Who wants in on this? All right, everybody pile in. Jesus is going to die for our sins. Everybody in agreement? Like, it's not that way. It's like, what good does that do you if it doesn't change you or transform you, right? So the Gospel of Thomas, the point of it is to say, listen, let's focus on exactly the things that Jesus said, because if we can unlock the meaning of these things, then that is where the true value lies. Not just letting it, like, being passive and saying, oh, well, he died for my sins, that's it. Like, we need to go back and focus in, and that's what this gospel has chosen to do. So there is hardly any narrative in the Gospel of Thomas, and the gospel does not tell a story of the life of Jesus. Rather, Thomas's Jesus is a teacher of wisdom, and the value of Jesus lies in what he has to say and how his sayings lead to wisdom and understanding. In saying two, Jesus described the Oh, that's what they were saying before. Saying one states, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Okay, it's the title of the... It's not a verse, it's a saying. So they're like, in saying one, okay, that makes sense. Now in saying two, so in the second saying, so in saying two, Jesus describes the epistemological process whereby one comes to insight and knowledge and the kingdom or reign of God. Let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. When one finds, one will be troubled. When one is troubled, one will marvel and will reign over all. Oh, I love this. Okay, this is going to be really fun getting into the Gospel of Thomas, because already here I'm seeing that, so let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. When one finds, one will be troubled. So when you start seeking wisdom and then start seeking the wisdom of your soul to correct your soul, you're going to start running into the shadow parts of yourself, the difficult parts of yourself, the parts of yourself that you don't want to see, the unconscious drives, the unconscious defense mechanisms, things you aren't aware of, subconscious. And so from a Kabbalistic perspective, I don't have charts out right now. Let's see. Let me get the chart deployed. All right, so these spheres are the governing dimensions of reality. They're also the governing dimensions of our psyche and human spirit, and they are a map of the cosmos. So when these, you see, these are all in pairs, and so when they're imbalanced, there's a certain level of stability in our life. right? When we have found ourselves at a level that we're living at, a level of consciousness, a level of exerting ourselves, a level of living and meeting life. We go along for a certain period of time until we get in a comfort zone. And then we start to stagnate. And then what does life do? Life shakes things up again. When you need to grow, when it's time for your soul to reveal more light, the metaphysical world starts putting pressure on you through the events of your life, and because it wants to reveal more of you, more of your greatness. So when it says, how does it say? When one finds, when you seek, searching your stuff out, when you find it, you will be troubled. One will be troubled. Things will be shaken up. There will be a friction, a stirring, a beginning of tension again. And it causes disruption and puts you off balance so that you are forced out of your comfort zone and pushed into your next level. So now that you know that, hear this sentence again. If I could ever find it. If I could only read. Okay, so let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. When one finds, one will be troubled. And like when you're seeking wisdom and you find some insight, you start to realize, oh, am I in alignment with this insight? Am I, do I need to change? Do I need to adjust? So it troubles you. And then you meet that. You start a process of wanting to align with that wisdom. So Jesus describes the epistemological process whereby one comes to insight and knowledge, and the kingdom or reign of God, let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. When one finds, one will be troubled. When one is troubled, one will marvel and will reign over all. So when one is troubled, meaning you got the fear of God in you, you got the awe, you've taken the time to look in and be, you know how the English saying, they're like, I can't be bothered. It's like, it's not worth it. I'm not going to put the trouble into it. And it's like, this is the opposite. It's like, I got bothered. I got bothered enough to marvel and to be in awe and allow transformation. And then once you allow that transformation, you have power over and dominion over what had power over you. So when one finds, one will be troubled. When one is troubled, one will marvel and will reign over all. The Greek Gospel of Thomas adds an additional stage to the interpretive process. And having reigned, one will rest. And so remember when we just finished the Gospel of Mary, when she told them the fullness of the knowledge and wisdom she had, then she described the soul would come to a place of rest and silence, and then she demonstrated that rest and silence. It's like when your tikkun correction is complete, there's no more work to do. It's like you can finally be at rest. You can finally be at peace, right? You can be in stillness. It's like, have you ever had a million things to do for so long and it's so ongoing that when you finally were finished, you were like, oh my God, everything's in its right place. I can finally just be at rest, but until then, it's like you can't rest until it's done. Same for our soul. Our soul has this work to do. And it has this desire to attain this wisdom and connect with this wisdom, and it doesn't want to rest until it connects, because that's the way the soul connects with the light, the Creator. The soul won't rest until it's connected in union with the Creator. And the only way to be connected in union with the Creator is to become like the Creator. We have to share that vibrational affinity, that vibrational resonance with the Creator. Such good tea. Tastes like celery. Okay. So, and one will rest. So, and the gospel, and the Greek Gospel of Thomas adds an additional stage to the interpretive process. And having reigned, one will rest. In other words, the quest for an understanding of the sayings of Jesus is a worthy enterprise to be undertaken with commitment. I can't be bothered. And although the way to knowledge may be difficult and even disturbing, those who persevere will discover God's reign and God's rest. As in Q and the New Testament Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas asks his disciples to seek and find. In the Gospel of Thomas, the sayings of Jesus are open to interpretation, so that the disciples and readers are encouraged to search for the meaning of the sayings of Jesus and complete his thoughts after him. So our whole shtick here is exactly what Jesus wanted us to do. So what do you think of that? The sayings of Jesus are open to interpretation so that the disciples and readers are encouraged to search for the meaning of the sayings of Jesus and complete his thoughts after him. The Gospel of Thomas is an interactive gospel, and wisdom and knowledge come when readers creatively encounter sayings of Jesus and respond to the sayings in an insightful manner. So that's an interesting sentence. The Gospel of Thomas is an interactive gospel, and wisdom and knowledge come when readers creatively encounter sayings of Jesus and respond to the sayings in an insightful manner. Get creative and open-minded with how you interpret it. Be insightful. If you be smart, you will learn. A number of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are especially cryptic and riddle-like. Does it intimidate us? We just finished the Gospel of Philip. And the need for creative interpretation is obvious. Much is at stake. Everything is at stake. Those who find the meaning of Jesus' sayings find life. The Gospel of Thomas proclaims that they come to realize that they are children of the living Father. Or, as Jesus puts it in saying 108, those who drink from his mouth will be like him, and he will be one with them, and they will understand what is hidden. Those who drink from his mouth, it's like those who thirst for his words, right? He told the woman at the well, like, if you knew who I was, you'd be asking me for a drink, right? Because he said, can you give me some water? The interactive nature of the Gospel of Thomas and the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas is underscored by Richard Valentassis. In his book, The Gospel of Thomas, when he just called his book The Gospel of Thomas. Copycat. Like he's already called that. So the interactive nature of the Gospel of Thomas and the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas is underscored by Richard Valentassis in his book, The Gospel of Thomas. Do you think he called it that so he could go around saying that he wrote the Gospel of Thomas? I wasn't lying, I really did. When he calls the theology of the Gospel of Thomas a performative theology, so interactive, the interactive nature of the Gospel of Thomas and the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas is underscored by Richard Valentassis in his book, The Gospel of Thomas, when he calls the theology of the Gospel of Thomas, let's say that again, a performative theology. He says that the theology emerges from the readers' and hearers' responses to the sayings and their sequence and their variety. So he says that the theology emerges from the readers' and hearers' responses to the sayings and their sequence and their variety. At the very end of his book, Valentassus writes, quote, "Knowledge emerges from an act of interpreting. The collection of sayings under the authorship of Jesus and editorship of Didymus, Judas-Thomas, Didymus, maybe it's not Didymus, it's Didymus, probably. Didymos. Okay, the collection of sayings under the authorship of Jesus and the editorship of Didymus Judas-Thomas demands a performance to unlock their individual and collective meaning. It requires work and toil to perform these and to discover. Note, it is not to learn, it is to discover. It's not to learn. This is not memorization. This is not learning a theory. This is discovery. This is inspiration, divine inspiration, right? So it requires work and toil to perform these and to discover. Note, it is not to learn the interpretation. So to discover the interpretation, not learn the interpretation. It means no one's giving you the interpretation. We're discovering it as we read it, right? It's a living word. So it's meant to prompt something in you, not just wait to be told what to think of it. Whereas a narrative defines carefully the actors and their actions, sayings simply float meaning without careful definition or careful control. Thus, this gospel proclaims the priority of living voice over narrative, just like we were saying, of textualized presence over narrative definition. So bringing these things into context, contextualize within like the presence of how you interpret it in the present circumstance that you are kind of like seeing it and relating it to and applying it to. The gospel remains performative. This emphasis upon the living voice of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas may be corroborated not only by the identification of Jesus as the living Jesus, but also by a grammatical feature of the sayings themselves. The sayings are introduced by quotation formulas. Jesus said, he said, and the like, in Coptic and similar forms. The Greek fragments, however, so we're right. So there's Coptic copies and then there's Greek copies. So in the Coptic and similar forms. Now the Greek fragments, however, employ the present indicative. And although in this volume we translate these quotation formulas with the English past tense, we could not very well employ the English present tense. So the Greek fragments, however, employ the present indicative. And although in this volume we translate these quotation formulas with the English past tense, we could very well employ the English present tense. We have interpreted this and write it out as like Jesus said or he said, but it could very well also be just as easily thought of as Jesus says and he says, like present tense. Okay, the living Jesus. The German translation in Nag Hammadi Dutch or Deutsch, and the German and English translation in Synopsis Couture Evangeliorium do in fact use the present tense. The sayings coming from the living voice of Jesus are not what Jesus once said as much as they are what Jesus continues to say. So it's not, they're not like presenting this information as this is something Jesus said one time, but this book is written as things Jesus says. He's living Jesus. He's living now. He was living then. He never stopped living. So it's like these are Jesus's sayings. They're in the present tense. He's still saying them now. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas thus confronts his disciples and readers of the Gospel with powerful sayings, but he does not pull rank. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus assumes very few Christological titles. And as Stephen Patterson notes, Jesus in this Gospel is just Jesus. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is not designated the Christ or the Messiah. He's not acclaimed Master or Lord. And when he refers to himself once in the Gospel in saying 86 as just child of humanity or son of man, he does so in the generic sense of referring to any person or himself as a human being. Not as in from the book of Daniel, the Son of Man, the prophet, the prophecy of the coming of the Messiah. It was a title, Son of Man. But they're saying when they use it in this book, he's just, lumping himself in with humanity. If Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is a child of humanity, so are other people called children of humanity. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is not presented as the unique or incarnate Son of God, and nothing is said of a cross with saving significance or an empty tomb. So nothing is said of a cross with saving significance or an empty tomb. Jesus is named the living Jesus. Jesus is named the living Jesus, but God is also said to be a living one. And followers of Jesus are called living ones as well. Referring to Jesus as the living one, then, is not a specific reference to the resurrection. Rather, this phrase indicates all that is part of the realm of life. And if Jesus is a living one in the Gospel of Thomas, he lives through his words and sayings. Some of what Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas has a familiar ring, and other utterances are quite new and startling. In general, it would appear that the Gospel of Thomas is not fundamentally dependent upon the New Testament Gospels, but it is an independent gospel and a primary source on the Jesus tradition. As elsewhere, including the New Testament Gospels, Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas proclaims the kingdom or reign of God. But here the kingdom is both inside and outside. As elsewhere, Jesus speaks in parables and stories, and although some of the parables are well known, others are new parables. The parable of the jar of meal, the parable of the assassin. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus echoes the words of the Delphic maximum and declares, "When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you dwell in poverty, and you are poverty." Jesus announces that children will enter the kingdom, but not business people and merchants. He says that two will be one, and male and female will become a single one. But the female must become male in order to enter the kingdom. Jesus seems to reject outward forms of piety and conventional family values, and instead he recommends spiritual observance and a new order of family. He states tersely, "Be passerby." When Thomas addresses Jesus as teacher and admits that he is unable to compare him to anything, Jesus denies that he is a teacher who is the source of truth and knowledge. "I am not your teacher because you have drunk. You have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring that I have tended." Jesus serves the spiritual beverage, but those with him must drink for themselves in order to be spiritually intoxicated. The Gospel of Thomas survives as the second tractate in Codex II of the Nag Hammadi library, where it is preserved in Coptic translation. 3 Greek fragments of the copies of the Gospel of Thomas also survive, as well as testimonia in early Christian literature, especially Hippolytus of Rome, Refutation of All Heresies. The variations among the several texts make it clear that the Gospel of Thomas went through several copies and changes could be made from one copy to another. The Coptic text of the Gospel of Thomas, like the other texts in Nag Hammadi library, is conserved at the Coptic Museum in Old Cairo, Egypt. And Papyrus Oxyrhynchus are housed respectively in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, the British Library in London, and Houghton Library at Harvard University. Most likely the Gospel of Thomas was composed in Greek, probably in Syria, perhaps at Edessa, where Thomas was revered and his bones venerated. Although some scholars prefer a 2nd century date for the composition of the Gospel of Thomas, a reasonable case can be made for a 1st century date for a first collection of sayings. So they're saying that it could be written as late as the 2nd century, but there's a good possibility that it was actually written in the 1st century when Jesus lived during the 1st century. So a reasonable case can be made for a 1st century date for a first collection of sayings. The Coptic Gospel of Thomas from the Nag Hammadi library was translated no later than the middle of the 4th century, but the Greek papyrus fragments have been dated much earlier, at least as early as the first half of the 3rd century. On the basis of such suggested dates, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, the first editors of the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, estimated that the original documents must have been composed at least half a century earlier, around 140 at the latest. More recently, Soren Giverson has revised these dates, and he has stated that on logical grounds that the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus fragments of the Gospel of Thomas may be assigned even earlier dates. The textual evidence from an early date for the Gospel of Thomas thus may rival that of any of the New Testament Gospels. So this is one of the oldest of all of them. The Gospel of Thomas also illustrates concerns often judged to be those that come to expression, particularly in the 1st century: disagreements about the apostleship, uncertainty about the role of James the Just, interest in sayings of Jesus and sayings collections and the like. Sayings in the Gospel of Thomas also seem to be transmitted in a form that is earlier than what we have in the canonical Gospels. Such may be noted, for instance, in parables where Thomas preserves parables of Jesus simply as stories, but the New Testament Gospels may append allegorical interpretations to the parables in an effort to explain them and apply them to new situations. One saying in the Gospel of Thomas, saying 17, offers words of Jesus. I shall give you what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, what has not arisen in the human heart. That sound very much like what Paul cites in his description of the wisdom Christians in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 2:9, in the middle of the first century. So the Gospel of Thomas is a sayings gospel representative of Thomas Christianity, and as such it has a goodly amount in common with another text from the codices of the Nag Hammadi library, the Book of Thomas, as well as a text not in the Gospel, or not in the Nag Hammadi collection, the Acts of Thomas. Sayings and themes from the Gospel of Thomas appear in the dialogue of the Savior, and Judas, perhaps Judas-Thomas, is one of the main participants in the discussion. In literary genre, the contents of the Gospel of Thomas resembles to a considerable extent of the synoptic sayings Gospel Q, and some scholars have attempted to identify a common source behind Thomas and Q. Unlike Q, however, the Gospel of Thomas has less of an apocalyptic and more of a mystical emphasis. And this Q is probably like not Q. It's probably a Greek letter that I don't know how to read, but it looks like a Q. It's probably like Omega. However, the Gospel of Thomas has less of an apocalyptic and more of a mystical emphasis, and Jesus in Thomas critiques approaches of those who show apocalyptic concern. Though there are hints of dialogue and narrative in the Gospel of Thomas, the development of those literary forms are much more evident in the Book of Thomas and in the dialogue of the Savior, which discusses between Jesus and Judas-Thomas, also involving in the dialogue of the Savior, Mary Magdalene and Matthew. And the Acts of Thomas with the pious story narrating the adventures of Thomas in India. Finally, the use of the Gospel of Thomas may be traced in other religions or other religious contexts as well. In the 3rd century, Mani adopted the concept of the twin and applied it to the divine presence that was with him. And later, Manichaean authors incorporated materials from the sayings of Thomas's Jesus into their own holy books. For example, the Manichaean Psalm book and Manichaean Kaphalaya. Many years thereafter, the medieval Islamic scholar Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali cited dozens of sayings of Prophet Isa in his book, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, and among them are sayings reminiscent of what Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. Since its publication a few decades ago, the Gospel of Thomas has proved to be the most celebrated of the Nag Hammadi texts, and it has been an influential and provocative source in discussions of the historical Jesus and early interpretations of Jesus. So, very interesting. So next week, we will actually get into the meat and we will start the actual reading of the Gospel. Our little fish bookmark. I'm excited. The sayings feel like we're gonna have a lot to talk about. All right. I hope that wasn't too hard to understand. It's sometimes these introductions have these like portions of words that I think only other scholars would know what they were referencing. It's like maybe referencing other pieces of scroll or studies or something. I don't know. So I tripped up over those a lot, but I think we got the gist of it. When it was written, the context, some of the insights around the gospel itself, but overall I think that'll give us a good basis to interpret and take in and understand the context around what the literature is itself. And so we can just focus on now letting the word sink in and letting ourselves interpret, which is suggested that is what we were. This is open to interpretation. It took us an hour to get to that end. All right, y'all, that is all for tonight. We will be back together tomorrow for our weekly energy oracle forecast, where we will be getting the spiritual weather for the week ahead. Until then, I hope may peace be with you. Just send prayers to the Middle East. Everywhere is under conflict right now. Just about almost everywhere, not everywhere, but several of the countries are in the midst of bombardments, I guess, by Iran retaliating from the attacks today. So just prayers for all the people on earth, for everything, from everything, for everything, for everyone. Just peace, love, and safety, and grace be with everyone. Ciao.